Hello and welcome back, this is ProTaleDev back with another Dungeon Farm Tycoon game, and what we're going to be looking at today is kind of a bit more of a short video, which is just looking at kind of fixes. That's all I've really done for the last week, is just trying to fix things and finish certain aspects of the game. So we're going to get straight into it. So if we go into the game and we look at our dungeon manager by clicking the button at the top left, we see that we've got no dungeons, as usual, same as what I've already shown. But if I place a dungeon down and then open the dungeon manager, we have our dungeon, but there was some issues with it where the dungeon manager just wasn't finished, and there was issues. Now it's all fixed. So if I just add a couple more dungeons and then look in our dungeon manager, you'll see that we've got our dungeons and the buttons are correct. We can see that we can edit them and we can go into them and create our dungeon. So let's actually look at that now. So if we create our own dungeon, previously we would actually have a lot of issues where we couldn't actually overlay those dungeons properly. So what would happen is we'd create a dungeon and then that dungeon would be on top of another one because they weren't being disabled correctly. And they weren't essentially keeping track of which one's activating which. So if we just create a little area here, with, I don't know, a room here and a room here, then you'll see that we've got a dungeon here, which what we can then do is we can actually exit. Now all these buttons are saying exit, but that's just because I just need to add one more condition into the statement, just to make it so that they don't appear for every dungeon. But what you'll do is you'll click exit, and then there you go. What will happen is we have now a dungeon. Now none of these has changed because we can because these aren't associated with each other anymore. They just changed the buttons because of that, like I said, that condition. But what we can do is we can actually go into this dungeon and have a look. Now nothing's obviously in here because we haven't done anything, and there's no differences. As you can see, it's just a normal dungeon. We do have our information down here. It's a little bit bigger than last time, but overall it hasn't changed that much. However, if we exit this dungeon now and let's create a second one, which we couldn't do before. Let's create a second one, and as you'll see straight away, all we've got is a basic room. So if we can, at the moment all of the edges will appear, but that's because it's again associated with the same dungeon, same as the buttons. So I just need to add one more condition for that aspect to determine which dungeon is which. That'll be simple to do. What we can do though is we can add in these, just add in a couple of, I don't know, let's add in one more room, like, I don't know, here. There we go. And maybe this right here. Now if we leave and do the same thing, back in our overworld, we've still got our dungeons, and then what we can actually do is we can go back to our previous one and edit our previous one, and as you can see it's still there. We can exit, go to our secondary one, and as you can see it's still there. So our dungeons are now associated with the correct dungeon. We can now create multiple. I could even create a third one if I wanted, and in fact let's just leave this one as just this, and now if we exit that, of course we can still go back to our previous first one. So the dungeons essentially is finished. For the most part, in terms of the dungeon manager, we can now specific dungeons are now associated with each other. The only thing I need to work out now is deleting them, but I'm going to have a separate UI that comes up, basically warning the player to, if they delete this, they will delete the dungeon in the manager as well. Back to our island, you can see that we've actually removed the lighting on the buildings, because they were causing a little bit of an issue and they didn't look good at night time, so I've removed that. In the dungeons, I've also, you could see it's just there when we were adventuring, but I've disabled the shadows on the lighting at the moment because I think it looks a little bit better. Another thing is adventurers will not appear underneath the paths anymore. They were previously appearing underneath. That was just to do with the sorting layer, and that was a quick change. And with the buildings also, it's kind of the same issue with the sorting, so now the light is actually projected on top of the buildings correctly. Another thing that you would have noticed is when I went into the dungeon, all of our UI was disabled apart from our player HUD, which is the health section, so our player stats. This is the only one that was disabled, that wasn't disabled, along with this. So our player resources, Also, the reason why this is now working, being able to put this into a dungeon, and I kept it separate, is because it's now set as a child for when the object is spawned. So when we spawn a specific dungeon, it's when we start creating and customizing within that dungeon, it's now all set as a child of that dungeon that was initially spawned. That way, when we disable a specific dungeon with a specific integer or an ID, it disables everything that's a child of that object, if that makes sense. I've cleaned up the UI. It's now very different and a little bit more organized than it was previously. So we have the UI at the bottom, which is the speed. That was at the top, now I've changed it and it's a little bit nicer to look at. We've also got the UI at the top, which has been separated a little bit. It's a little bit longer. We have separate sections. So before, when we had maximum population and current population, it's now been associated with just population. We've also got things like wanting to stay, which is I think this one, and and the amount of that can stay. We have things that have been separated, like here. I think this is maximum people that can stay. Maximum population is this one, while current population is this. Of course, you've still got the happiness, the rating, and the money. The reason this is short is because when you enter the dungeon to edit, you actually see the dungeon specific tools here. This means that we can always extend it out later if we have more categories that we want, or if specifically we want more categories in this one. Otherwise it would have just gotten too long, and there's no point in having the option of tools for the overworld or tools for the dungeon when you can't even use them. Maximum rating, because before I have a maximum rating of a certain amount. This one I'm just going to make it so that you can have as much rating as you want, and it will increase it. There'll be a maximum in the code of how much you can get it, but I think it can also be fun for players to try and see how high they can get their rating, and I don't think it's necessary to have it in the resource bar. Okay, so I'm now going to show you what it looks like with the monsters. So I fixed the UI. The UI on all the monsters is now spawning correctly with the stats correctly, and I can now show you what it looks like inside our dungeons with those specific monsters. So let's just spawn one for now, and let's look into it. So let's edit and let's create a bunch of rooms, maybe just a basic straight down area, and I think that'll be fine. And then let's just create a devil. Okay, so one monster to showcase this, and let's exit and then start our adventure. So let's quickly show what we've got here. So if I go down here, you'll see our monster. It's our young devil. It's level 11, and its effect is freezing. You can also see its health is 55 out of 55. And this is of course randomly spawned. So this the effect is randomly spawned, and the health and level is randomly spawned, but also their amount of gold will be random. So if I quickly pause this and then show off this little monster that we just spawned, where is it? Here it is. You see it a little bit better here, and what I can show off is the monster stats script. So here we've got the number of the monster's ID, as well as the level, the damage they're doing based on their level, and their health overall. Everything is calculated based on their level, and we have their health, their gold, and their time, which is their health. So if we bring this down, well, you're not going to see it yet until it's actually on. Let me just unpause this, and there you go. You can see the health got dropped down. Obviously we were paused so you couldn't see it, but you can see the health has dropped down. I think this is quite nice. We can also do the same with lots and lots of other monsters. So let's do that. Let's bring this up here and let's do the same thing with a bunch of monsters. So let's exit and let's edit. You can see our monster is still up here. It's still spawned. And let's add in a couple of others. So let's add in maybe this guy, and then maybe this guy and this guy. And let's go back into our adventure. Now these guys come completely after us, and if we just quickly pause, we can separate them a little bit better. The reason they overlap is because they've not got a collision on them yet, just for testing purposes. Let's disable that. Let's bring these round. So now we have a bunch of different monsters. And you can see that our levels are different. So we have 29, we have different amounts of health. The higher the level, the higher the health, and the more damage they'll do. So we can just click on any of these and see what our stats are. You'll see that they've got different amounts of damage, different amounts of gold that they drop. Over here we have 3 of the same monsters. These monsters are all set on their basic 3 types of dungeons. So we have our 3 dungeons, our small, medium and large. And these dungeons will actually spawn a specific amount of levels. So we'll have the same monsters, but they'll have different levels. So let's go into here. And as you can see, we have our levels. So 12, 74 and 128. If we quickly redo that, it'll give us a random level. So as you can see, this one's always going to be lower than the medium's always going to be lower than the large. The large is always going to be the most extreme, but it's also going to be the biggest dungeon and worth the most gold. So if we click on this guy is really powerful. So this guy is the most extreme and would spawn in the largest dungeon. He has a tremendous amount of health, but he'll drop a tremendous amount of gold. 422 gold he'll drop. Of course his level is really high. And we've got the damage while is 1.2, that's because of a bug. One last thing to show is that when the pause menu is now changed, so instead of the timer being at the top left, to keep it a bit more cleaner, it's now in the pause menu. You'll just be able to pause it whenever you want and see where we are, how many days have passed, what time it is. So that's all I have to show for this week. We've managed to get a lot done, a lot of fixes, a lot of behind the scenes. It doesn't look like a whole lot, but there was a lot of code optimization and bug fixing and solutions that had to be created through the code. But ultimately, we now have a working dungeon manager, and that was really the big thing for this game that needed to be fixed. So now I'll be moving on to things like the crafting, getting that finished, and some of the more dungeon aspects, so like the collisions and fixing, and adding the crystal resource probably. So this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you in the next Dungeon Farm Tycoon video.